want to put these kidney failure deaths or renal failure deaths or excess deaths in general in some sort of context, we need to talk first about what is called underlying cause of death and multiple cause of death. And we'll discuss why that, or it will become clear why that is really important. John has studied death certificates for, well, I don't know how many, thousands of death certificates? Probably, right?
Well, individually, yeah, thousands, maybe even more than that, maybe even into the 10,000. So I have 1.6 million with no redactions. So I've been able to look at even what hospital they died in, what doctor was attending at time of death, the burial plot. I have everything for every death. And when you look at them individually, it shows whether or not the data has integrity in terms of statistical inferences from the data. So we can talk about that as we move through the UCoD underlying cause of death versus multiple causes.
Yes, and so the death certificates in the United States vary a little bit from state to state, apparently. They are not exactly the same, but the CDC has some sort of standard death certificate with certain fields that need to be on any state's death certificate. And I was thinking that I should show that because I certainly wasn't familiar with it. And then, John, you can explain what is shown on this death certificate and how it works and how it's filled out by people, because you have a lot of experience about that, having looked at so many. Here, this is the one that I found. So this is from the National Library of Medicine.
That's the most important part of it. You've got the most important part right there.
Yeah, and this is nice because it's filled in. This is kind of like an example to teach doctors how to fill in a death certificate, because that's something they have to learn how to do. And so this is an example, and you can actually, it's a good example, I think. And you can walk people through this example, and then it will become clear what it all means. Yeah.
All right. So what you have on the screen is the cause of death, and then that's part one. It says cause of death, and then part one, and there's A, B, C, D. But below that is also important. Is part two. It's hard to see that it's Roman numeral 2, but that's what it is.
This one here. Mm-hmm.
And so those are significant contributing conditions to death. Generally, and I'm going to start with that one. Okay. So generally what that is supposed to be used for is conditions that may have contributed, such as on this one, it says diabetes, COPD, and smoking. And those are pretty much what's supposed to be there, because, if somebody dies from a heart disease or heart problem, it may have been caused originally by diabetes somewhere in the background, but you don't know that it's causing that. It's just, we'll put that on the death certificate so that we can track the kind of people who have these diseases. So if they have diabetes or not, it goes in part 2. COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and then smoking. Also, there would be like alcoholism. There might be some other, life, the way they conducted their life, like obesity. Obesity is a lot of times is in part 2, or morbid obesity is actually a separate one. So they'll write, well, I shouldn't say they, right? So every state is different in custom and practice. We can talk about that in a minute. But morbid obesity is generally more extreme than obesity. So those are contributing conditions. Now let's get into the cause of death. Oh, and by the way, this format of part 1 and part 2, where part 1 has A, B, C, D, this is consistent across all the states. And I think it's consistent across the world, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't have time to look at every nation in the world. But this particular format, the nuanced differences occur in each state based on custom and practice of what they're taught in the office, in the local culture, how to fill these out. But let's get into how it's supposed to be filled out, which is this ideal one that you have on the screen from the CDC. All right, so A is the immediate cause of death, and it says it right there, immediate cause, although we don't talk about that in public or in research papers or anything like that, but that is the immediate. What does that mean? That's the last thing that happened before death. So A says rupture of myocardium. So the myocardium is the muscle-y part of the heart, and it was ruptured. But what caused that? The B, C, and D are not always filled out. So it could be just A and B with nothing in C and D, or it could be A, B, C with nothing in D, or it could just be A. The last one going down is called the UCoD, or it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be. If they fill it out properly, then the last one in part one. So if C is the last one, that would be the UCoD, ideally. In this one, all four are filled out. D, the last one, says atherosclerotic coronary artery disease. That caused C, which is coronary artery thrombosis. So clots in the arteries that feed the heart. B is acute myocardial infarction. Okay, that's a sudden heart attack. And the sudden heart attack caused A, which is the ruptured myocardium, which is the immediate cause of death. So atherosclerosis caused the artery thrombosis, caused the heart attack that caused the rupture. That's how this ideal death certificate reads. And it's important.
Right. And yeah, right. And it makes a lot of sense. It's a good idea to do it this way.
It is.
This cascading way.
It is a very good idea. A lot of good ideas go astray when people don't follow the rules. And what you have is that the doctors attending at time of death who fill out death records, a lot of them forget their training, and they're not in a medical examiner's office. They're not in a coroner's office, and they just want to go about their job and get their job done. And they don't care about the death certificate so much. So they just write stuff on it. They'll write full sentences across all four lines. Most of them do that. Most of them write, let's say, acute intracranial hemorrhage in the setting of thrombocytopenia in a person recently vaccinated. I had to pick one out of my head, right? So that's an exact one. That was Diane Dubois. Acute intracranial hemorrhage in the setting of, this is written across when they run out of room on the first line A, they continue on line B. In the setting of in the setting of thrombocytopenia, and then they run out of room. They go to C, in a person recently, and then they go to D, vaccinated for COVID-19.
How often did you find examples like that?
That is very often, which led me to believe, and I can't give you a number of percentage. That would be a good analysis for a research paper that I just discussed with somebody yesterday. Actually, we could take examples to show. But of course, it would be our subjective opinion as to what the UCoD is. And remember, the UCoD is the last thing written. So if a doctor's just writing a sentence, they're not thinking about, what's the beginning of the causal chain of events that cause death? Oh, let me put that in the bottom one. They're not thinking that. They're just writing a sentence. And wherever the UCoD is within that sentence, that if the software at the CDC that reads these, and again, it's another thing we need to talk about, but these all go, the English words, the prose, goes to the CDC. The CDC applies the codes using software called Transax and Acme. And when they apply the codes, the record gets sent back to the states with the codes on them. So
what do they do with it? What do they do if it's just like sentences written all over these lines? Can the parser even deal with that, or does that have to be done by hand?
The answer is yes. The parser deals with some, but not all. So it has algorithms within it, and I'm not telling you this because I know how the code was written. I have deduced this from reading them. And it doesn't always just take the last thing written when somebody writes a sentence. It does have some semblance of algorithmic intelligence that it selects what it thinks or what the author of the code thinks that should be the UCoD. But it's not perfect. This ideal death certificate sounds great. It's a great idea. But most of the doctors don't execute it. The medical examiners are pretty good. Until they purposely lie, I will say lie, purposely misinform, purposely write false information, purposely write the wrong order. Let me give you an example right now. Brianna McCarthy was 30. She died from an ischemic stroke they said that COVID caused the stroke. I think in the original death certificate, COVID was on line C, line D was empty. And I'm doing this by memory. So if I'm wrong about the details, don't crucify me. But
Mhm.
so C, I think, was COVID. They said COVID caused an ischemic stroke that caused, was it a brain herniation, or I don't know. The immediate cause was something to do with stroke that caused the death.
Mhm.
So 3 years later, after pressure from the family to say, hey, she didn't die from COVID. You had that on record 3 months earlier from a positive test without any symptoms. She died from the vaccine, and you know that because she went to the hospital hours later looking for treatment for a headache. And then she went back the next day. Her headache was so bad. And then the third time she went in, her family brought her because she didn't recognize her family. And she had been in full blown stroke since she got the vaccine. So for a few days, it was just getting worse and worse and worse. So what did they do? They fixed the death record. They wrote COVID vaccine, but did they write COVID vaccine as the UCoD, the last line? Now this is a medical examiner amending her prior statement where she had lied and said that she died from COVID as the root cause, the UCoD. No, what she did was she moved COVID to D and she inserted in C the vaccine. So now if you read that death record from that medical examiner, it reads, the vaccine caused COVID that caused the stroke, caused her death.
No kidding.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, that's how
Wow.
you read it, based on the rules. That is,
Yes.
and it's ridiculous, right? The COVID caused the vaccine, except in reality, COVID did cause the vaccine because she wouldn't have gotten
Mhm.
vaccinated for COVID if COVID didn't exist, right? So, I mean, it's so silly, but we're talking about the death of a 30-year-old woman whose family loved her. And, they
Yeah.
just want truth and we just want truth. But that's an example of a purposeful false representation on a death record to lead people to believe for 3 years that COVID caused the stroke. And it went into, if you multiply that out across all the data, you will see papers being written about COVID causing strokes. Oh, it's COVID that caused the stroke. Oh, well, how come it didn't happen very much in 2020 during COVID and it started happening in 2021 after the vaccine? Because you're lying on the death records.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's one example of purposeful. And then I told you about the accidental, where most of the doctors who are not medical examiners, they just write any order, they just write anything down. Sometimes, Cornelia, there are things in part two that should be in part one, and there are things in part one that should be in part two, and there are things that in the wrong order in A, B, C, D. So to me, we can show the numbers on UCoD and we can talk about it, but there's something
Okay.
very.
Does it
Go ahead. Sorry.
I have a question for you, John. Does it also have you also observed when you looked at all these death certificates that sometimes doctors will write the same thing, that they will mention, let's say, coronary artery disease in part one, but will also mention it in part two?
The same thing mentioned in both.
Yes.
No, not so much. Um,
Okay. Not so
yeah,
much. Okay.
I haven't seen
But
that.
okay.
No,
So, but it sounds like many doctors don't really know how to fill out these
no,
death
and
certificates. They are also not so easy to fill out because you really have to know the deceased person. And, given whatever the circumstances are, the doctor might not have the required knowledge and, or might not have the required time to actually think about it and do this.
yeah, let me
Because it's not always, I mean, here's a very clear-cut case, but there are many, many cases where it's not as clear-cut, I would imagine.
Yeah, let me answer your question in a different way, or reform your question a little bit differently. I have, even in my case that I filed a petition for writ of certiorari at the Supreme Court. It was accepted on Monday and docketed, and
Great.
there's a 1 in
Congratulations.
1,000 chance it'll be heard, 1 in 1,000. But the original exhibit from that case that I wrote almost 3.5 years ago, I show specific medical examiners and doctors and the patterns that they use in writing. And so I thought you were going to ask me, did you notice that certain doctors write the same thing on everybody's death record? And the answer is, yeah, I noticed that.
Mm.
They write the same phrase. In fact, Michelle Matthews, one of the defendants in my lawsuit against the state, she wrote the phrase exactly: complications of Corona 19 viral infection, over and over and over.
Yeah.
Complications. And in many of the death records where she wrote that in A, complications of coronavirus 19 or coronavirus 19 viral infection. Okay. COVID. She wrote that exact phrase in part 1A with nothing after that in part 1 and nothing after that in part 2. That's the only thing on the death records. How do you have complications of something where you don't write the complications down on the death record? Like,
Yeah, it doesn't make
was it
sense.
pneumonia? Was it a heart
Mhm.
attack? Was it a stroke? I mean, how did the person die? Complications of COVID. That's all that's written. So it gets coded as a COVID death and nothing else. And COVID becomes the UCoD because nothing else follows that. She did that, like, I don't know, somewhere between 12 and 19 times. I have so many numbers in my head, it's hard to remember. But it's more than 10. And then in other times, she did write like obesity or one other thing, and that was in part 2. Very little information. I have another guy in my exhibit F of my lawsuit. He wrote some kind of heart thing. I forget what it was, but he wrote the heart thing on everybody's death record, which led me to believe maybe he's a cardiologist. Maybe that's all he thinks about. But there's no way that all those people, and I think if he's not a cardiologist, he might have been a cardiologist, became a medical examiner, and he just writes that. You know what? When they get busy, they just write anything on the death record. I know
Yeah.
it's all about human
Mm.
behavior.
So, John, as you said that often not all the parts A, B, C, D are filled in. What happens when, let's say, part D, which is the really important parts, the underlying cause of death? What if that is not filled in? What does the parser do?
It uses C. C.
It uses C. What and so if C isn't filled in, it uses B, and if B isn't filled in, it uses A?
That's correct. Like the example I just used for
Oh,
Michelle Matthews, where she only wrote one
right.
thing in
So,
part A. Part A
mhm.
becomes not only the immediate cause, it also becomes the UCOD or the underlying. Oh, for the audience, UCOD, underlying cause of death, is a confusing term. You might think that, oh, well, that's the underlying cause. It really means the root cause. So it's the underlying cause of the underlying cause of the underlying cause if there are 3 or 4 causes, right, in the causal
The
chain.
root cause,
It's
exactly.
the
Yes.
original thing
Mhm.
that happened that set off the causal chain of events that caused the death eventually.
Yeah, and I don't even know. I mean, there must be cases where there are various root causes where you can't just distill it into one root cause.
Right. Oh,
Okay, so it's yeah, it sounds like it's pretty. The whole thing is pretty vague and chaotic, and depending on how this thing is filled out, I mean, it really influences the death statistics, right? And the causes that are given for deaths
very
in the
much.
United States.
Yeah, it very much influences it. In fact, yeah, and again, for the audience, let's define MCoD, multiple cause of death. All that means is that the code associated with the words appeared on the death record. Part 1, part 2, A, B, C, D, doesn't matter. If it's MCoD, it's somewhere on the death record. And so if you want to look at statistical relationships to the records, then if you look at UCoD, it's tenuous whether or not you have accurate data because you have different custom and practice by state. So if you look within one state, you might have some accuracy with regard to what is the UCoD. If you look across the nation, now you're getting kind of, you're really confounding it because AFib is a go-to in Minnesota for somebody who might have died from something to do with the heart. They were found on their floor and they're old. So, well, it's probably, well, just write AFib, right? Atrial fibrillation.
Hmm.
They do that a lot in Minnesota. Massachusetts, they'll more often use cardiac arrhythmia, or a lot of them. Cardiac arrest is the biggest one by far, and it has potentially nothing to do with the heart. All it means is heart stopped. That's what cardiac arrest is. It is not a heart attack. The regular people confuse it with heart. Oh, he had a heart attack. He had cardiac arrest. No, no. If you drown, the last thing that happens before you die is cardiac arrest. If you have pneumonia, last thing that happens before you die is you have cardiac arrest. Did they have anything to do with a
Right.
heart attack? No. Your heart stopped.
Right. So we all die of cardiac arrest.
Exactly. So the data gets very confounded. The MCoD is multiple cause of death. If there's any mention, it's on there. And that's my go-to. That's why I only track MCoD. I stopped using UCoD long ago when I recognized in the death records that it's not a fair and accurate representation, and it could really mess up the signals.
Okay. So I think that is really important what you just said. Namely that this MCoD, multiple causes of death, picks up anything that is on the death certificate, no matter whether it's in part 1 or in part 2. That's very important because part 2 says enter other significant conditions contributing to death but not resulting in the underlying cause given in part 1. That whole sentence is pretty confusing. So it's conditions that contribute to the death, but in the end, then it didn't result in the root cause of the death. I mean, kind of contradictory, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, because when you first told me about multiple causes of death, I thought that was all the stuff that was just listed in part 2. So so that's wrong. So multiple causes of death is really anything that is in either part 1 or part 2.
Yes, and under ceteris paribus, people say ceteris paribus, means all other things being equal. It really means other things in parity. But what that means is, everybody's making all these mistakes on death records. But under all
Mm-hmm.
other things being equal, if you just use any instance of it on a death record, you're capturing the intent of the death certifier in writing it on the death record. And so
Okay.
even if it's different in Minnesota, Connecticut, Massachusetts, they intended for it to be on the death record somewhere. And a lot of times they write, COVID is written in part 2, and it's in a lot of them. In the vaccine, in the ones that they actually did write, the vaccine killed them. Sometimes it's listed in part 2. In part 2, I found a few times, COVID-19 vaccine on date of death. It's like they got the COVID vaccine, died of a heart attack, but the COVID vaccine is in part 2. They're not saying the COVID vaccine might have caused a heart attack 5 minutes later for anaphylaxis. So they throw it in part 2. So as long as it appears that I am inferring intent of the death certifier that they wanted us to know. They wanted us to know that whatever's in there. A lot of times it's like pulmonary embolism is thrown in part 2. And you can't see in part 2 the timing. In part 1, it doesn't. What's missing from part 1 here is almost all the states have another field. And in that field, it's the amount of time from the presentation of that particular symptom, say B, acute myocardial infarction. It'll say 5 years or 5 minutes or 10 hours. It'll have a number and then a time frame. Sometimes the number is left out and it says minutes, hours, days, years, right? And then sometimes they'll add the number and it'll be like 2 years or 2 minutes. I have one that's 5 minutes, and that's a heart attack, drop dead, and the vaccine is listed on there. So he dropped dead of a vaccine in 5 minutes in the clinic. And they didn't even code that. They didn't code that for a COVID vaccine, but it's written on.
So they quoted that as a heart attack.
And they left out the vaccine, but we're not to that section of the interview yet. So I'll hold that.
So question, kidney failures. We are going to talk about the kidney failure, the increase in kidney failures later on. Kidney failure, is that something that you have seen listed on part 2? And does it make sense to list kidney failure on part 2? Because kidney failure, isn't that something you will die from?
So let's differentiate right now the words kidney failure, because you stepped in a good one here. But let me get this out of the way. CKD is chronic kidney disease, which is N18. I do see N18, or they don't write the codes; they write words in part 2. So in part 2, you do see chronic kidney disease, or CKD, in part 2.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The AKI, which is acute kidney injury, N17, which if you look it up, you'll see it listed as acute renal failure. Right. They mean the same thing. It's just the more, I guess, modern way to say it is acute kidney injury. Excuse me, where you'll see acute kidney injury almost exclusively on death records. But if you look up the code N17 that results from AKI, you'll see it listed as acute renal failure. But that's acute, so that means sudden kidney failure. It's not chronic. Some of them, Cornelia, will write acute on chronic kidney disease or kidney failure. What
They will write what? Acute and chronic?
on acute on chronic. That's
What does that mean?
that's the words that they use. What that means is they had kidney disease, but all of a sudden something happened. Like they've had kidney disease for years.
Oh, got
They had
it.
10 years left
Okay.
to live, and all of a sudden, like we expected them to live another 10 years, and then
Right.
boom, like it just happened. Like their kidneys failed, and the vaccine, and also hospital stuff. Hospital, I call them hospital homicides. COVID treatment program, the drugs that they use in
Mhm.
the COVID treatment plan protocol, that also causes people with CKD, maybe stage 1, maybe they're not even on dialysis, they just have some kidney problems. They got 15, 20, even 30 years left to live, but they either take the COVID treatment plan or they take the vaccine, and they're in the hospital and they die from kidney failure like in days. That's
Mhm.
acute on chronic because they had a history but all of a sudden something happened. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who never had a kidney problem, all of a sudden have a kidney problem and die. That's also acute kidney injury without the chronic.
So to list acute kidney failure in part 2 does not make
Doesn't make
sense.
sense. I
Is
haven't
that
seen it.
correct?
I haven't seen it listed there.
Okay.
I've only seen it in part 1.
Okay.
It's almost,
Interesting.
you know, I have to do everything from memory because there's so much information and it would take a long time to go through all the records and database. I can show you, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's in
But
UCoD very often at all, and it doesn't make sense that it would be, because when you start feeling bad because your kidneys are failing,
right.
you go to the hospital. I mean, you start getting really bad, and you might even pass out. Somebody brings you there. They determine through blood test and urine test, they know that your kidneys are failing almost right away, and they probably put you on dialysis right away, and then you're living, right? And you might
Mhm.
die in the hospital 10 days later. What's the last thing you die of? They just don't write AKI, and that's it. It, it's something else happens. The other thing is you get pneumonia, your heart starts failing, your kidneys fail.
Okay.
That
So I guess it would make sense to have N18 chronic kidney disease as in D as underlying or root cause, because that's and that would then lead to maybe an acute kidney failure.
Yeah,
But the reason I'm asking about this part 2 and kidney and acute kidney failure is the following, and I'm just mentioning it now. We'll see it later in the data, because when you look at the data in the CDC's death database, you see a very large increase in kidney failure or acute renal failure deaths that are listed as underlying, so as root cause of death. So, corresponding to part 1, and if correctly filled out, that would have been in line D. But you see an even larger, a significantly larger increase when you look at multiple causes of death. So you look at any of the words on the death certificate.
you went into the hospital for COVID, and then maybe they get pneumonia on there, and they get AKI on there, and then they get the heart attack. And AKI could be like that's the last thing that happened before death, but it's usually not. It's usually B. But it could be. It's just not the last one listed. Heart.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, makes sense. Also, with the whole confusion of how doctors fill this in, they might not even do it correctly, and
Yeah,
who knows whether D is the root cause. Okay, and that would also explain the huge increase if you take multiple causes of death,
exactly.
because it just picks up everything. Okay, good, good. Excellent. All right. So underlying cause of death, then really looking for that is not going to give you the answers. And we're going to actually see that later on when we look at the data. And that's good to know, because when we first talked about it last time, I ran the queries myself, and I only looked at cause of death, underlying cause of death. And that gave me very different data. So, and if you hadn't told me, John, no, you have to look at multiple causes of death, I wouldn't even seen by how much the renal deaths increased.
Yeah,
So maybe that is one of the reasons. Do you think that this hasn't been picked up earlier? Because this has been going on for years.
I think it's purposeful that they haven't picked up on it. I think they know it and they're afraid because this is really an indication that because in my graphs, I can show the timing to the week that this happened.
Hmm.
And it didn't happen with COVID. It happened with a human intervention, not just when the drugs were approved, but months later when the drugs were incentivized by the federal government with much big piles of money. When the big piles of money incentivized the use of certain drugs, that's when it went up. And when the big piles of
Like
money incentivized
remdesivir,
the COVID vaccine, that's when it went up.
right?
So it wasn't when the disease came, it was when the incentives came. The incentives drove the acute kidney injury. It's very there. My graphs show that very clearly. But to answer your question, the acute kidney injury has been around for years. They should have known it. I've been talking about it 3.5 years, Cornelia. I can't even get
Yes.
people on
Yep.
our side. Now, here's the more important thing about what you said is that the scientists, the data jocks out there, the guys who are really good at data, they're all relying on that UCoD versus MCoD statistic. And they think there's a lot of significance there. And they put those graphs out and it's weird because how can I be the only one that found this? And then I realized, well, I'm the only one that has 1.6 million non-redacted death records where I can read what the death certifier wrote. And I can compare
Hmm.
through my sampling, which is thousands of that I've read, tens of thousands probably. It's been 3.5 years. I've probably seen 10,000. And from my experience, that's how I was able to determine the value and integrity of the data of UCoD. And there's not much value in it. There's not much value in it at all, which is why I stopped using it 3 years ago. And everybody else is still
Yes.
using it.
Yeah, and John, I by just looking at the data that shows this enormous increase in MCODs and renal failures compared to underlying cause of death,
I did a
because that just
Yeah, I did a
Mhm.
podcast once, one of my own, where I can take my time and do stuff. And I recorded like, okay, let me pick this death record. And I just picked a random death record. Let's go through this. It was exactly backwards. They wrote, A where D should be and D where A should be. Exactly backwards. And it was picked up the UCOD, and I showed that the software picked up the wrong UCOD. And it was just a random selection showing people live. I can't even. I've done so many 150 different videos. I don't know which one it was, but yeah. I mean, it happens all the time.
Well, I'm not surprised because I mean, when I think about it, I don't know how I would organize a death certificate, but having the root cause at the very bottom, I think, is not the most intuitive thing to do. I would I would tend to think that the root cause would be at the very top because it's the most important.
So you're talking about in time order. This is in
Yes,
reverse time order. We live our
right,
lives and
exactly.
think in time order generally.
Hmm.
What happened from the beginning and go to the end. The way this is supposed to be written, you start with the end and go back to the beginning. And
Yes. So that is confusing.
it is. It is.
No wonder the doctors are confused too. And probably they don't write death certificates several times every day, hopefully. So it's probably something they do relatively
Well,
rarely.
it depends. Like if it's an old folks home, the doctors that attend those, they do a lot more death records than a family practitioner who sees kids and adult and middle-aged adults. They'll maybe do one a year, but the old folks home doctors will do 10 or 20 a year. You know, it's different.
Yes. Yeah. By the way, are these death certificates online? I mean, do they fill them in on a computer or are there some handwritten
Oh,
ones?
I don't know actually. Yeah, I don't know. I've never seen one handwritten. It's always been typed.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of confusion between these and hospital records with ICD-10 codes, because they have medical coders in the hospital. It doesn't go to the CDC. And so people start arguing with me, and I say, I'm not talking about hospital records and insurance companies. I'm talking about death records. It's
Mhm.
completely different system.